The storm swept across the prairie like a wild beast, tearing at the land with ruthless claws of wind and sheets of rain, lightning splitting the black skies wide open, thunder rolling across the wide plains like drums of war. And in the heart of that storm stood a woman tied to a weather-worn post, her dress plastered to her body, her hair tangled, her eyes burning with both fear and defiance. Her name was Clara, a bride cast aside, punished by those who despised her for daring to defy a marriage arranged without love. And as the storm raged, she prayed in silence for freedom, for a hand to cut her loose, for a miracle to come before the cold or the lightning swallowed her whole. And then, through the sheets of rain and the howl of the gale, came the pounding of hooves, steady, strong, defiant against the fury of the storm. And a figure emerged, a tall cowboy with a broad-brimmed hat pressed low against the rain, his duster whipping in the wind, his eyes locked onto her like a man who had searched his whole life and finally found what he was meant to protect. And without hesitation he swung from his saddle, his boots sinking into the mud as he strode toward her, his knife flashing in the lightning's glare as he cut through the ropes that had bruised her wrists, his voice rough yet warm as he said, "Come home with me." And in that moment, though she was shivering and broken, she felt the words burn into her soul like fire in the coldest night. Clara collapsed into his arms, the cowboy holding her close as if shielding her from the storm itself, and she whispered through chattering teeth, "Why would you risk yourself for me?" And he looked into her eyes, rain running down his scarred face, his jaw hard with conviction, and he said, "Because no woman deserves chains, not under the sky God painted for freedom, and not while I draw breath." And with that he lifted her into his saddle, mounting behind her with the strength of a man born of earth and storm, wrapping his arms around her as his horse surged forward through the torrent, carrying them away from the cruel town that had left her to die. The ride was long, the storm unforgiving, but she felt safe pressed against his chest, hearing the steady rhythm of his heart like an anchor in the chaos. And though she had never seen him before, there was something in his touch, in the way he sheltered her, that felt like destiny. When they finally reached the dim light of his cabin on the edge of the valley, he pulled her inside, laid a blanket over her shoulders, and knelt by the fire he quickly built, his eyes never leaving hers. And the silence between them was charged, not awkward but alive, like the spark that leaps from steel to stone, ready to set the world aflame. Clara studied him in the firelight. His hands were rough with work, his face marked by hardship, but his eyes carried a gentleness that broke her heart wide open. And she thought of the men who had bound her, men of her own kin and community, and how none of them had ever looked at her as this stranger did, as if she were not a burden, not a prize, not an object, but a woman strong and whole, deserving of choice and of life. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she whispered, "You don't even know me." And the cowboy leaned closer, his voice low, steady, and fierce as he said, "I know enough, that you were left to die in a storm and still stood tall until I got to you, that you've got a heart that didn't break when others tried to chain it. And that's all I need to know, right?" Now he gave her his name, Caleb, and the sound of it lingered in the room like a promise, and though her body ached, her spirit stirred with something she had not felt in years, hope. Outside the storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, Clara felt a strange peace settle over her, a sense that she was not alone anymore, that perhaps this man, this cowboy who had appeared like a guardian out of the tempest, might be the beginning of a life she thought impossible, a life of freedom, of love, of dignity. The night stretched on as they spoke softly, sharing fragments of their pasts, her story of loss, betrayal, and the cruel tradition that bound her, his story of leaving behind a broken family and carving his life out of the land with only his courage and his horse for company. And as dawn broke, painting the sky with strokes of gold and crimson, Clara knew that the words he had spoken in the storm were more than an invitation. They were a vow. Come home with me did not mean shelter for the night. It meant he was offering her a place in his world, in his heart, a chance to rebuild not as a discarded bride, but as a woman who had been chosen, not by force but by fate. And she whispered back with a trembling smile, "Then take me home, Caleb." And he pulled her close, their shadows merging in the light of the fire. As outside the storm finally broke, the land washed clean as if the heavens themselves had blessed their beginning. And so the story of a bride tied to a post and the cowboy who cut her free was not an ending, but the spark of something eternal. And dear listeners, If you want to walk with Clara and Caleb through more storms, more love and more battles of the heart, make sure the morning after the storm was quiet, the air washed clean by the night's fury, the smell of damp earth heavy around Caleb's cabin, and Clara sat wrapped in the wool blanket he had draped around her shoulders, staring out the small window at the valley stretching wide and endless, her heart a mixture of fear, relief, and confusion, because though she had been saved, though her body was warm and safe, her mind still echoed with the voices of those who had bound her to the post, her uncle's harsh commands, the jeering laughter of men who called themselves protectors of tradition, the cruel faces of women who turned their eyes away as though her suffering was deserved. She remembered each knot digging into her wrists, each drop of rain that fell like judgment, and though Caleb's voice had cut through the storm like salvation, she could not yet silence the doubts whispering that perhaps she was still nothing more than a burden carried into his world, an unwanted soul who had stumbled into a man's solitary life. And as these thoughts tormented her, Caleb came up behind her, his boots soft on the wooden floor, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, grounding her with the simple weight of his presence. "Storms past," he said quietly, his voice low and steady like the land itself, and when she turned to look at him, she saw the exhaustion etched into his features, the dark circles under his eyes, the faint bruise on his arm where he must have fought through the storm to reach her, and her throat tightened with unspoken gratitude. Yet before she could thank him, he gave her a cup of coffee, steaming and rich, and sat across from her with a silence that was not awkward but patient, as though he knew she needed time to speak in her own way, in her own rhythm. Finally she found her voice, soft but trembling. "They'll come for me," she whispered. "The ones who tied me there. They don't let go of women so easily. They'll call me a runaway, a shame to the family. They'll say you stole me away." Caleb met her gaze, his eyes unflinching, his jaw hard with a resolve she did not understand but somehow trusted, and he said, "Let them come." 3 simple words that carried the weight of mountains, words that told her he would not hand her back to chains, not while he stood breathing, and something deep inside her, some broken part of her soul, began to stitch itself together at the sound of his promise. Still, the fear did not vanish. She told him of her father, long dead, of how her mother's weakness had left her at the mercy of uncles who cared only for control and appearances, of how they had promised her hand to a man twice her age, a man with wealth but no heart, a man who saw her as a possession to be broken, and when she refused, when she dared to say no, they had called it rebellion, a sin against her bloodline, and tied her to the post as punishment, as an example. Caleb listened without interruption, his hand clenched into a fist on the table, his chest rising and falling with anger he did not voice, until finally he leaned forward, his voice like thunder rolling low. "They tied you up in the storm to break your spirit. But they failed, Clara. They failed because you're here. You're alive, and I cut you loose. If they come, they'll have to reckon with me." She blinked back tears, shaken by the certainty in his words, and for the first time she believed that maybe she was not doomed to be returned, that maybe fate had shifted the night he rode through the storm. Days passed, each one slowly chipping away at her fear, each one painting a picture of Caleb she could not ignore, the way he worked the land with steady hands, tending the horses, mending the fence, chopping wood with strength that seemed endless, yet always glancing back at her as though checking that she was still there, that she was not about to vanish like smoke. The way he spoke little, but when he did, his words were heavy with meaning, never wasted, never careless, and she found herself listening, as though his voice were the anchor to her wandering soul, the way he respected her silence, never demanding, never pressing, but simply offering his world as though it were hers to step into when she was ready. She began to help where she could, her hands clumsy at first, unused to the rhythm of a ranch, but Caleb only smiled faintly and guided her, showing her how to hold a rope, how to brush down the horse, how to plant seeds in the small patch of garden outside the cabin, and with every task, she felt a strange sense of belonging grow inside her, something she had never felt in her uncle's house, something that tasted of freedom and dignity. Yet even as her heart grew lighter, the shadow of her past loomed. One evening, as the sun bled crimson across the plains, a rider appeared on the horizon, then 2, then 3, until a group of 6 men rode slowly toward the cabin, dust rising behind them like a warning, and Clara froze at the window, her breath caught, because she recognized the man in front, her uncle, his hat low, his eyes cold as stone, and beside him the man she had been promised to, his face twisted with pride and cruelty, his mouth already sneering as though he had already won. Caleb stepped beside her, his presence like a shield, and said calmly, "Stay inside," before walking out the door to meet them. She pressed her hand to the window, her heart hammering as she watched him stand alone before 6 men, his shoulders squared, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver, though he did not draw, not yet, and she could hear the muffled voices, her uncle's booming tone demanding her return, calling her ungrateful, accusing Caleb of theft, of dishonor. Caleb's reply steady, unshaken. "She chose to stay. She's free here. You've got no claim on her." And then the promised man's voice, oily and venomous, shouting that Caleb would regret interfering, that no cowboy could stand against the will of a family determined to keep its honor. Lightning seemed to crackle again in the air, though the storm was gone, and Clara felt her knees tremble, torn between fear that Caleb would be hurt and awe that he stood so calmly, so fiercely, as though he were a wall between her and every chain. The men muttered, threats spilling like venom. But finally they turned, retreating for now, dust trailing behind them as the horizon swallowed their figures, and Caleb returned inside, his face grim but his eyes soft as he looked at her, saying simply, "This isn't over." "But neither are we." Clara rushed into his arms, the sobs she had held back for days breaking free, and he held her tight, whispering, "You're safe with me," again and again until her breathing steadied, and in that embrace, she realized that safety was no longer just about shelter from storms. It was about him, about the man who had chosen to stand between her and the world's cruelty, about the choice she had now to stand beside him as well. That night, as the fire burned low, she sat beside Caleb, their shoulders brushing, their hands tentatively finding each other, fingers interlacing slowly, naturally, as though they had always fit, and though danger loomed, though her uncle would surely return with more men, more fury, Clara no longer felt powerless, for she had found something stronger than fear. She had found love growing in the ashes of a storm, love fierce and untamed, love that tied her not with ropes but with trust. And so the bride once bound to a post was now bound by her own choice, her heart tied to a cowboy who had looked at her suffering and answered not with pity but with strength, with the promise of home. My friends, if you want to see how Clara and Caleb fight the battles ahead, how love can stand unshaken even against the storms of men and tradition, then don't forget to